Good morning again, and thank you so much for joining us today. This is Word of Faith Fellowship. We're sharing with you all the wonderful things that Jesus has done in our lives. We've been doing this radio program now for going on 8 months, and we've been sharing with you the truth about our church. There's been some allegations against our church that we wanted to address, and so we've done it on the radio program. And you can go back and see our radio programs on our website, which is wordoffaithfellowship.org. And you'll see a link to our radio programs. Many of our first radio programs, we address many of the false allegations that have been circulated in the media against our church. We answer questions. We bring on a lot of people who address lies. And so it's a very useful piece of information if you would go to that website. We've also been sharing with you testimonies of what God has done in our lives. And you've heard from many, many people in our church. We've actually had 120 people share with you so far, and we're going to keep going. So today I have John and Carol Williams, and they're here. They want to share with you their testimony of what God's done in their life, how God has transformed their life. So we're going to start off. And so, John, if you want to start, go ahead.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Jim, for having us, and good morning, Rutherford County. We appreciate you listening to our testimonies. Truly, we're changed people. God has changed our lives. I know that I came out of a very, very bad life in my younger years. My dad was an alcoholic, and he was very, very angry all the time. He was very abusive to our family. So when I got old enough, at 19, I went and joined the Marines just to get away from that situation. He was always like that. But I had a lot of problems, that plagued me throughout the years. I had problems with alcohol, with smoking, lustful desires, profanity, and so forth and so forth. And it was just tormenting throughout my life because I just never could seem to get these things away from me. I didn't know what they were, but I know they were damaging throughout my military career. When I went into the Marine Corps, I served 4.5 years in the Marine Corps, and I finally got out of the Marines, but I liked the military, so I went into the Air Force in 1965, about 4 months after my discharge. And in the Air Force, I was sent overseas to Thailand. Actually, I had orders for Cam Ranh Bay, Vietnam, but when I got into Bangkok, Monday morning when we all went down to fly into Vietnam, they had changed my orders. There was about 50 of us. They changed the orders. And at that time, Thailand was building up their bases, so they sent our people into there to help build those bases up. And when I got there, was about 500 on that base. When I left, it was over 5,000. So that's how fast we built that place. And we were in support of the Vietnam War. We had twin-engine bombers out of Thailand, and they would, of course, go in every day into Cambodia, Vietnam, Laos, wherever they could find the enemy and drop their bombs and come back. So this was a continuing thing. And of course, I was there for a year, and when I came back into SAC headquarters, and I worked there for a year and went down to Florida, in Orlando, Florida. Back then we had McCoy Air Force Base. Mm-hmm. And when I was in Orlando, I got TDY, or temporary orders, into Guam. And in Guam we had support of Vietnam. We had all these B-52 bombers that would fly them out 2 a day, probably 2 every hour, and they would go into Vietnam and drop their bombs and come back. And so eventually I came back within 6 months after that. And during that time I was at Guam, I'd get letters from my dear wife here, and she would start talking to me about going to this church that she'll explain to you later, and how that the word there and what was happening there was changing her life. And so when I came back from Guam that Sunday morning, she said, she woke me up and she said, "Are you going to church with me and the children?" And I said, "Yes, I'll go with you." So I went down there to the church, and it was a large Baptist church.
Had you ever been to church before? Did you grow up going to church?
Not really. I was Catholic as I grew up. I started off in Presbyterian. That's where I got my base for Jesus. I learned a lot, but I was probably about 8, 9 years old back then, but I learned a lot. In fact, I remember, I know I don't have it, but I remember that at night I would go out into the field next door. Like I said, my dad drank every penny we had. There was very little food. But I remembered I'd go out to the field next door as a little child and get on my knees and I said, Jesus, I don't know who you are, but we really need your help if you are real. And it seemed like every day food would come from every direction. In other words, he provided for our family, and just kind of more or less let me know as a young child that he was there. But eventually, I went to another church with my mother, and then I didn't go back to church until I came here to Florida. But as I came in, and the associate pastor, his name was Bernie Fowler. He was a precious man, his whole family. But he took hold of me, and I went, I cried out to the Lord at that time, and I believe that was the start of my walk with Jesus, because it seemed like from that point on up until today, there's always been a desire to tell people about Jesus. So I know he worked on me. He was pulling me into the things that he wanted me to be, his will. And me and my wife both were walking with him. In fact, I got into the bus ministry, and we went every Saturday. Bernie would go with me, and on this route, it had a large route, but we'd bring anywhere from 90 to 100 children every Sunday morning into the church. And so we stayed there, and then finally I left there, and we went to Hawaii. When I got to Hawaii, I became the bus minister there.
Let me ask you you mentioned that you had problems with drinking alcohol. You mentioned that you had, you were sharing with us earlier that you had problems with your mouth. You were in the Marines. I think you mentioned you had problems with lustful desires. You're a young man. You're in the Marines. You're having all this alcohol. You're having. I think you and I were talking. You were smoking at this time. Right. So now you start going to church, and did any of those start to change? Yes,
like I said, I was in the Air Force at the time, but when I started going to that church, I know the first time I went up and with Bernie, and then Bernie said, if you got any desires, just tell the Lord and he'll help you. And so he left me, and I went there, and I said, Lord, if you're real, and I have to remember that back when I was a child, but I said, Lord, if you're real, and I believe you are, I have some problems that I need. One thing is I need my dirty mouth cleaned, because in the Marines and, throughout my life, I've always had a real foul mouth. I mean, I don't even know how I stood around my family with it, but I did. And then I had a problem with alcohol. I was fine until I came back from overseas. I started drinking overseas again, and I asked him about that. Well, within no time at all, the Lord honored those requests. I didn't ask about my smoking then, but it does come. And he changed me. I mean, it seemed like I would work all day in the Air Force, and when I get off, I'd go to the clubs at night and work in the bars, and then after that, I would go into these other bars downtown, and I was just trying to make all the money I could, but, it just seemed like I couldn't get a hold of anything. And so one Saturday, I remember I was talking to Bernie, and I said, Bernie, I just can't do this, going out on bus ministry and anything. He said, why? I said, I have the time. I said, I got all these jobs. And he said, well, let's pray about it. So we prayed, and I said, Lord, you're going to have to help me. And so he did. Within 2 weeks, all my jobs quit. I didn't have any job. And so actually...
You're talking about all these bars. You're working at these bars after you get off duty, and they all stopped.
Right. They all stopped. It seemed like I'd go to one, and like the NCO club, he said, John, we just can't use you anymore. We're cutting back. So I said, okay. So I went to the next bar, and they got rid of me there. So eventually I didn't have any part-time jobs, except, we were running the base family campground, and that's the only thing we had left. Which took away everything. Every hindrance was really in my way that I could go out there every Saturday morning. Me and my 3 children would go out there, and we would visit every child on our route, and I'd have pockets full of gum or something, and I'd always give them something sweet when I left. And the children just loved us, and it was a kind of a ministry to the children, but we would actually go back sometime and be able to talk to the parents, so it gave us an opening to the parents.
And you were sharing, you prayed at, you asked God, I have this problem with drinking, and did you stop?
It stopped eventually. I mean, I just really didn't go back to it. So, but God took away those those desires for alcohol, which was a blessing. That's like I say, I couldn't go out there and drink. Well, the smoking, I hadn't talked to him about that yet because I enjoyed smoking, but I was smoking about 4 or 5 packs a day. I was heavily a smoker. The doctor said I was a borderline emphysemic, and if I didn't quit soon, that I would die. Well, it didn't bother me, but that happened really when I was in Hawaii. When I went to Hawaii, and I went up to the bus director. He had 13 buses, but they only had 3 routes. Just nobody there to take all of it.
Were you actually transferred from Florida to Hawaii? Was this like a base in Hawaii that you were transferred to?
Right.
Okay.
They closed the base in Orlando because of Disney World. We were the only base that was the only airport around that was big enough to bring in the big aircraft for the the tourists for there. And so we went from there to Hawaii. And when I got there, I went and seen the bus director one day. I mean, the guy that was in charge. And I said, I see you got all those buses there. I'd like to join your bus route. And he looked at me and he said, I can't use you, John. And I said, what do you mean you can't use me? I said, you got all the buses and nobody. He said, well, I'll be honest with you. He said, you smoke. And of course I said, well, it doesn't say in the Bible you can't smoke. And he, give him my answers. But he said, well, it's not the fact that you can't smoke. It's the fact it's a hindrance between you and bringing people to the Lord. Well, I never looked at it like that. And so at that moment he was still talking away. And I was sitting there and the Lord spoke so clear to me. And he said, John, do you want me or do you want them cigarettes? And I said, Lord, I want you. And he said, okay. And he took away every desire for cigarettes. He took away the taste. He took everything. And even to prove it to me, of course, I was doubtful, but when I went back next week to see the doctor, because I had just come from that bronchitis, and I told him what happened, and he kind of laughed at me, and he said, oh, yeah. And I said, well, why don't you go ahead and give me another x-ray and let's see. Okay. And they did, and he called me back there, and I went back, and he was shaking his head, and I said, what's wrong, doctor? He said, I can't believe it. You have had a miracle. He said, you got the lungs of a baby. He said, it's incredible. He showed me the 2 x-rays. The one prior was totally black, eat up from, from the smoking, but then the other one, I had pink lungs again. And I've never had bronchitis, but maybe once or twice since that year, 1973.
And did you stop smoking at that time?
Well, yes, I did. I have never smoked since that day, and God took it away. There's no way that I could have ever stopped because in fact, I just bought a brand new lighter and a pack of cigarettes, and I took them out and I gave them to Bob, and he threw them in the trash can, and that was the last I ever seen of smoking. And then, of course, I stopped my drinking over there also. Well, I stopped drinking before, but it was still the taste, but it's gone forever. I also prayed about these lustful desires, and I've been tormented with them for years and years, as I said. But before I get to that, that'll come later. But while I was over there, we joined this church, and I run the bus route, and we were running, at that time, they were running about 30 every Sunday. Well, before I left, we were running well over 1,000 children. And then from there, we finally, I went to
This is picking up children, bringing them to church.
Right, and then taking them back home, yeah.
Okay.
So that was over 1,000 every Sunday. And then, of course, I went to 2 bases, but the thing was, I had a burning desire in my heart, and still do, from that time in Florida. I wanted to tell everybody about Jesus. I mean, I went all these bases, and I went from place to place, even anybody, even to the base commanders I would go to and talk to them about Jesus. And I had this one job I was working at, and even I was told to either back off or they would send me off the base. Well, I didn't back off, and they did send me off the base, but that's fine. They sent me to the other base, and I started preaching there. And then from there, they sent me to headquarters, which was, quite a few people, and I got to talk to all those. So it was just a burning desire in my heart. I was so happy and so delighted in my heart that Jesus was working, and He was working in me. So from there, I just told everybody I could. I just wanted everybody to know the peace and the happiness that we felt inside because of our walk with the Lord, and how good and kind He was in giving us deliverance. So then when I came back, let's see, there I came. Okay, there I came and went to the church, and then my dad was real sick. My dad had Parkinson's disease, and he eventually died, but he was real bad, so they sent me back down to San Antonio. He was with my mom and my brother, so I went back because she kept wanting me to come home and help. So they sent me to San Antonio, where there I worked in Kelly Air Force Base, and then from there, we stayed there, and I worked in churches there. And then they sent me from there, they sent me to Myrtle Beach Air Force Base, where I retired. And then from Myrtle Beach Air Force Base, we went to Greenville, South Carolina. And then when we got to Greenville, we were going to churches there. It was a pastor that we really loved. He seemed to really have a heart for helping people. I know he helped both of us very much. But just one day, not knowing, but we came in one day and Sunday morning, and he said, "This is the last day I'll be here. I won't even be here tonight." He said, "I think I've given you everything that I can give you." Well, that really devastated all of us, and he didn't come back that night. Well, at that time, I got mad, and I just quit going to church, period. And so I went without going to church for about 5 years there. And so eventually we went from there back down to Wilmington. And so when I was in Wilmington, it was on a Sunday. We'd just eat lunch, and I was in there watching TV, waiting on Carol. And somebody spoke to me, and he said, "Enough is enough." Well, I thought it was Carol, so I get up. I went in there. I said, "What do you want, honey?" And she said, "I haven't said anything." I said, You didn't talk to me?" She said, "No." She said, "Go sit down. I'll be there in a minute." So I went and sat down, and I was sitting there pondering in my mind what that was. And it came a second time to me. He said, "Enough is enough." And so I got up and I went in there. I said, "Carol, what are you saying?" She said, "I'm not saying anything. I haven't said a word. Go sit down." And so I went in and turned the TV off. I didn't know, maybe it was something on there. And he spoke to me a third time. He said, "John, enough is enough." And then I knew who it was. And I started weeping and crying, and I said, "What are you trying to say to me, Lord?" He said, "It's time to come back to church." And I said, "Well, church," I said, "Lord," I says, "I really don't like your church. I don't like the hypocrites and so forth." And as I was talking, and I know he was listening, but he said, "Nevertheless, it's time to come back." So I said, "Lord, I'll come back, but you have to take me to a church that'll teach me truth, that'll help me with these situations, change our lives," and I told him, and he never answered me. Well, so in another series of events, we wound up going to Leland, New Jerusalem, which was affiliated with Word of Faith somehow, and they really wanted to help me. And of course, still skeptical because and I told him, I said, "Well, the one thing," I told the pastor, we talked for a long while, and I said, "One problem I got is these lustful desires." And I said, "They've been in me all of my life, and it's time for them to get out." And so he said, "Well, you need deliverance." Well, I'd never heard of deliverance, of course. And then he went out of town, came up to hear the Word of Faith for a pastor conference or something. Well, here again, I got mad again. I did have problems with anger too as I was growing up. That finally left. But one Tuesday night, our associate pastor, Rich Dolan, called and he said, "John, can you come over here tonight at 7?" I said, "Sure." And so I went over and I met with him and Glenn Webb. And that was it, nobody else. And I said, what's going on? And they said, well, the pastor called and said that you're to get deliverance for these lustful desires. I said, oh. I said, well, I thought he forgot about me. No, he didn't forget you. He's just up there right now getting help too. So they started praying, and they prayed, and they put me in a chair, and they prayed, and they prayed, and, you know, they would just say, come out of him, come out of him. Of course, I wasn't used to this, and this went on for about 15 minutes, and I was kind of getting tired of it, really, because nothing was happening that I felt, and I was about ready to leave, and about that time, I felt something move inside of me, and of course, Glenn said, what's going on? What's going on? I said, something feels like it's moving inside of me. And they said, yes, thank you, Jesus. And they started praying more and more and more. And finally, that devil left me. And that's the day I started believing in deliverance. And I've been getting deliverance ever since I've been here.
Did you feel a change in your heart during this prayer time? You felt like something left you? You're talking about the lustful desires. You had been set free from alcohol. You've been set free from smoking. God was helping you with your mouth. But this was the one thing that, as I'm hearing you share, this is the one thing that was still there, lingering, and trying to get help. So you felt actually something leave you?
Absolutely. I felt it leave me. I mean, it was gone. And that was God showing me that I did need. I didn't understand it, but I know I had cried out to God, and I said, Lord, I want everything that you have for me, because, you know, through our walk in the Lord, you know, a lot of churches taught that, you know, that deliverance was dead, you know, no longer, no healing and so forth. And of course, Carol will tell you about healing, but and me too. I've been healed of a stroke in 2000, and I had triple bypass and double knee surgery, and God has healed me through every bit of this. So actually, you know, I know that it's true. I know that God operates in our lives day by day, bringing us out of these systems when there seems like there's no hope, when there seems like it's impossible, and it seems like the right doctor's there, and you can't help but believe that God is real. And I know He changed my life. And then, of course, eventually we came up here. We started coming up here for seminars.
This is Word of Faith Fellowship,
right?
Church
Word of
here.
Faith, yeah.
Started visiting the church.
And then there was one weekend that we went back, and on our way back, Carol and I both heard very clearly we're to move up here, and that was in '95. Well, really, we didn't come up here, and she came up here in '99. Yeah, and then I came up here in 2000. I was working down there, and I really didn't want to quit that job, but it was a blessing that I did hear the voice of God that told me to come up here, because I had the stroke right after that, and if I had been down there, I don't know what would have happened. I probably would be alive today. And so since we've been up here, you know, we really have, our lives have changed. We love, and I'd like to say this, Sam and Jane Whaley are the most wonderful people in the world. I mean, there's all these things you hear and read in the paper and nothing but a bunch of lies. There's no abuse in that church. If anybody knows abuse, it's me. I've been in it all my life in the Marine Corps. I know what abuse is. There is zero abuse in there. And Jane and Sam are, I call them Mom and Pop, because they are true parents to me. My parents did the best they could, but they didn't change my life and help me to change these things like these are. And I love them both dearly, and I'll be here until the Lord takes me home. I don't plan on going anywhere, but all the lies you hear, and that's what it is, it's lies. There's no truth in any of it.
And thank you, John, so much. Powerful testimony. Carol, we just have a few minutes left. I know you want to share a little bit, so go ahead.
Well, I don't know where to start. I've got such a few minutes, but I guess the best way to start is to start where God really started doing a work in my heart. And when we started going to New Jerusalem, and I had suffered for about 6 years with severe back situations. Could hardly get around, crawled around on my hands and knees most of the time because I couldn't walk. And I started getting prayer for that, and after about 2 months, it was gone. After getting prayer and getting prayer and getting prayer, and then November of 1995, I was diagnosed with colon cancer, and that was devastating. And of course, the devil comes immediately to attack your mind with, "Oh, you're going to die. You're going to die." Then I would get prayer, and I'd get prayer, and I'd get prayer, and after that, I went through 9 months of chemotherapy, and somehow got through all that, and then I ended my chemo in October, and in May, I went to get blood work done, and just a follow-up thing, and the blood work that they had done showed that I had cancer cells growing somewhere. So they started running me through all kinds of tests trying to find out where it was, and they found a spot on my liver. Well, I thought, you can't live without your liver. But anyway, so went to see the doctor, and he was very positive, which was encouraging. He was very positive because it was just the beginning stages of this liver cancer, and I had the left lobe of my liver removed, and I have not had cancer since. It's been all these years,
20 years.
almost 20 years or so now, and I haven't had any more cancer. And I'm just grateful, and I know it was Jesus that brought me through it all and caused me to keep my eyes on him through the whole thing. At the very beginning, it was hard because I felt like I felt like God was against me when I first got the first announcement of that. And I thought, well, Jesus, I'm doing all I know to do, but it was a stepping stone, really, because each test, each situation I had to go through, each thing caused me to cry out to him. And I had to. I mean, I wouldn't have made it otherwise. I mean, it was just such a devastating time in my life, and God got me through it, and I'm just grateful.
He did, and we have a couple minutes left. You were sharing with me, Carol, last night. We were talking about your childhood, and I know we ran out of time, but I want you to share just a little bit, because I think it's great for the listeners too, how you were treated at school, and it made you withdraw, and how God's been helping you.
Yes.
If you can just share a little bit about that.
Yes. Okay. When I was beginning school, I was a very sickly child. I kept tonsillitis all the time. I had every childhood disease that would come down the road. I got it, and which caused me to miss a lot of school. And because of that, I never knew what was going on in class when I was there. I was always so far behind. And when teachers would call on you and you didn't know the answer, or later on in years, like you have spelling bees and all this kind of stuff, and you don't know how to spell these words, and you get laughed at and chuckled at, and people don't want you on their team. And anyway, you find yourself pulling away from people because you don't want to be seen, and you kind of hide. Really, you're hide. Just withdraw, and that affected most of my adult life. And I'd say when I came here and I started working at the cafe at the mall, I was put in positions I had to reach out to people. And that was my deliverance, really. A lot of it was learning how to be friendly to people and learn how to communicate with people without being pulled away, and because you had to. That was that was my breaking point, really, with learning how to reach out to people and be sweet to people. And I was going to think this morning too. I don't know if I have time, but I was always scared to death of elderly people. And now that I'm no longer at the cafe, God has me with a lot of elderly people, and I'm so grateful, and I'm so thankful. I thank Jesus for every day.
And I think it's a powerful testimony. You talk about growing up, things happen to us that sometimes affect us for the rest of our life. They make us withdraw, and how now you're learning you don't have to be like that. That's not who God made you to be. And when you get God's love in your heart, it changes all of that. Even when you have things happen when you're younger, God's love in your heart makes you who you're supposed to be. You're not withdrawn. Right. I would have never known that about you, because you're always so reaching out to people. But it's because Jesus changed your heart. Jesus can change all our hearts. And so we're running out of time, but as you heard, God is able to change our lives. You heard from John. He had all these problems, drinking, smoking, bad mouth, lustful desires, and you see his life, how God changes one thing and then God brings him to another place and God changes this area, and then God wants us to be free so we can serve him. And what a great testimony where God had a hold of his life. God brought him where he needed to be totally free so he can serve him. And of course Carol as well, God's taken care of her. God's brought her through these trials and tests with the cancer, and what a wonderful testimony we've heard today. And I thank you again for listening. This is Word of Faith Fellowship, and we're here Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, 8:30 to 9.